Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's Network MindOUT webinar. My name is Sally Morris. I'm the National MindOUT Coordinator with the National LGBTI Health Alliance. Before we get started, we'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the country throughout Australia and acknowledge their diversity, histories and knowledge and their continuing connections to land and country. And we pay our respects to all Australian Indigenous peoples and their cultures and to elders past, present and future generations, including any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. Today we have Katie Larsen from Neami National, who's the Manager of Innovation and Projects, who's going to be talking about the process that Neami National has gone through to respond to diversity and to support inclusive practice within their organisation. So I'm really looking forward to having Katie speak today. So Neami National actually is one of the project partners in the MindOUT Champions project, and the Alliance has been working alongside Neami National for quite a few years, and it's really quite exciting to see their work progress and to have Katie to speak about that today. So I'm going to hand over to Katie. Before I head off, just to let people know they can ask questions. There is a chat box at the lower bottom side of your screen. So the talk box says chat. You can type any questions to Katie there, and we'll be taking questions at the end. So feel free to post any questions throughout the webinar, but we'll be responding to questions at the end of today's webinar. Today also we'll be switching between PowerPoint and video, so there'll just be a couple of moments when we're just sort of switching technology, so please just be patient with us for that. And also if anyone does have any technology issues, please also just put a message there in the chat box and I'll see that and hopefully be able to assist with any technology issues. So thank you everyone for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to Katie. So thank you, Katie.
Thanks very much, Sally, and thank you everyone for listening in today. So yeah, Sally said I'm the Manager of Innovation and Projects at Neami National, and so my role is working across a range of projects, and one of those is leading some of our work around diversity and inclusion, and I've been doing that for about 18 months, and the conversation that I'm sort of hoping to lead today is just really about how that process has evolved for us from kind of early recognition of the work that needed to be done into, I guess, the direction that we're going now, which is as the title you'll see on your screen, is actually using design thinking to cultivate inclusion in mental health services. So I'll talk you through some of that process, what we use, what we've found helpful, where we're at, what we're learning, and hopefully that will be useful for some of you in your work also, and also welcome any feedback as well. So just a little bit about who we are. So we've been around for about 30 years and have become one of the largest providers of community mental health services in Australia. In 2016, we also started MeWell, which is our NDIS service provider. So that is work in progress as well, as we go through a lot of change in the mental health sector, particularly in Victoria. Our vision is for full citizenship for all people living with a mental illness in Australian society. And I think that's kind of important to note here, because that's I guess it kind of captures for us as an organisation why it's so important that we're doing work around diversity and inclusion and that kind of those broader meanings of inclusion and citizenship in the community and society in which you live. So this is an old slide, so it's out of date, but it does show that where we're based. So we're based in 5 states across Australia as both Neami and growing as MeWell in those states as well. So it's been started out in Victoria initially in the northeastern suburbs and have grown very, very quickly, which presents its own exciting moments and also challenges for the organisation. And so that's where we run. So this is a bit of a story time moment. So I often like to include this when talking about this work, because I think for so many of us who work in the inclusion space, there's generally a story about why we do and what brings us to that. and this is mine. So this is me when I was about 21 years old or 22 years old, and I was living in Toronto, in Canada for a year. I'd recently come out prior to going to Toronto to myself and to a few trusted people, but not to many people. And then I happened to roll up to do my my third year of my undergraduate at Larsen University in Toronto, and found myself in my student accommodation living just down the road and around the corner from the sort of the gay village there on Church Street. So I had a wonderful time that year, enjoyed myself a lot, managed to pass uni as well, which was fantastic. And this is me at the Pride March towards the end of my time in Toronto. And I sort of include it because it's, I'm obviously having a good time, but I was also very, very scared. I was going back to face the music a little bit with a lot of family and friends at home who I was not sure how they were going to receive news of my sexuality, and that kind of process, it sort of just preempted a process in my life where I went back and I had a pretty difficult time. There's a lot of self-destructive behaviour and resulting mental health issues, and so it was it was a difficult process, and I guess a lot of why I work in mental health now, and I feel very passionately about these issues is the journey that I went on from there. And one of the things that always sticks with me about that is that I was very lucky. I had a lot of support and a lot of resources to understand my mental health difficulties, and to really be able to eventually understand how some of them interrelated with my experience of my sexuality and internalized homophobia and all of those challenging experiences. But I was very, very lucky, and I in the midst of all of that, in the midst of pretty difficult periods of chronic anxiety, I thought, if I can ever sort this out and get past this, if I can recover from this, then I want to make sure that whatever I do stuff that is actually useful and helpful for people who don't have the same privilege as me to be able to get the kind of support that I did and have the opportunity to seek that support. So I always like to just kind of bring that into place, this work. I think, it really drives me in why I'm so committed to how we think about mental health service access for people who don't have a lot of opportunity, and how we really, really dig into those issues where that service access might have particular barriers or difficulties relating to being part of a minority or a marginalised group. So going into a little bit about where we started at Neami. So we started this work, it was kind of identified as an issue about 2.5, 3 years ago. And that was really in the LGBTIQ space. And that came from a few different staff members sort of saying, well, I think we need to do more about this. And we've got to have some action as an organisation to get us being a bit more active and understanding of what those particular challenges are. So it was pretty grassroots, that change at that point. And it was really one of those, I think, and a lot of people find this in organisations, can be one of those sort of invisible problems. Like if you don't actively hear about it, which you often don't, then it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And there was a growing sense that this was part of the problem. So diversity wasn't necessarily part of the conversation that we were having at Neami. It wasn't that there was anyone actively thinking it wasn't a good idea. It was just that it wasn't on the agenda necessarily. And it was that kind of line that I've heard a few times, I guess, throughout my work, is we don't really have that here, or that's not really an issue, but it's often, so it's starting to raise awareness that, we knew this was statistically and academically a problem, and but we didn't know where we were at as an organisation. So that was the sort of the start of the question: is what is our responsibility? What is our responsibility as a mainstream mental health organisation to actually be actively addressing the access of marginalised groups and populations, rather than sort of expecting people to come to us if there's an issue. So the position that we were in, so as you said, for a national organisation, grown very, very fast, We have we had a particularly active group of people in Victoria talking about the LGBTIQ experience. We had pockets of really good work. Work in some cases, we had services working really closely with Aboriginal communities or delivering services to Aboriginal peoples and communities. We had some really good pockets of work in the called space, but it was inconsistent. And it kind of depended on passion or the obvious or immediate need of those particular teams or consumers, and it didn't really dig into unconscious bias or this kind of problematic stuff around what if we're making decisions, if we are making decisions about them, rather than actually hearing what communities need and what supports would be useful. We also have a situation because we operate both in metro and regional environments. In some cases, there was sort of questions, well, we're not a specialist service, so we don't need to be providing, specialist LGBTIQ or specialist Aboriginal services. But in some cases, we're the only mental health service in the places that we operate. So it's really, really important that that everywhere, but particularly in those cases, that we have an understanding about cultural safety and access, and how we might unintentionally, just in the way that we operate, actually be reinforcing some of those barriers to service entry. The other thing that we sort of really wanted to highlight early on, I guess, in positioning what the need was sort of the general comments that often come up, I think, in big organisations that have a whole heap of priorities and a whole lot of stuff they're trying to manage on any given day, usually with not enough funding, was sort of the comments around things like, it's not a priority, or no one has complained, we welcome everyone but we can't please everyone, we don't have time, we don't have the resources, how do we decide to support one particular group or one particular issue over another, or it's just not really an issue for us at this time. So those are the kind of little things that I think unintentionally can come up and may not necessarily be directly said, but it can be a bit of a mindset. So we started to go, okay, well, how do we unpick some of that in what we're doing too? We're in a pretty good position at Neami. We're a values-based organisation with a strong commitment to social justice, and as I mentioned earlier, our vision is for full citizenship for people living with a mental illness. So all of those things combined put us in a really strong position to go, okay, well, we know that this is actually what we're about as an organisation, so how do we support that? And the other thing around positioning the problem in our case was just being aware that we have, like many organisations, just so many different types of service models that are operating, and that anything that we were going to develop or think about needed to reflect and understand those different service models and not provide like a one kind of fit solution to diversity and inclusion. That is never going to work for us. So these were some of the, I guess, the early learnings and activities that we undertook. So when we were working quite locally rather than as a national organisational policy or approach, these were some of the early learnings out of that process. So the first one being to listen, that we have to have the perspectives of the people and communities that we're talking about in the room and their voices being heard. We started to do that through things like we ran national staff surveys around LGBTIQ inclusion, around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander experiences of cultural safety, and started to try to get that conversation going and actually hear back what we needed. We had a lot of information about best practice, but we also wanted to balance that with our particular context. So recognising, actually looking at the unique and varying factors relating to diversity, and looking at how we don't just say, well, everyone's welcome, but actually position that to the proactive of affirming and valuing identity, culture and difference, and actually starting to integrate that into the way that we do things, which leads me to integration. So again, it not being, I think where we were sitting previously was that that diversity and inclusion was often sort of an, it probably doesn't sound great, but like an added extra. It was like an additional area of work that we knew we needed to focus on once we got on top of all the other stuff. And of course, we all know you never get on top of all the other stuff. So we started to go, okay, well, if we're going to have this as part of the conversation at the most senior levels of the organisation, if it's going to actually lead to change, then it needs to be integrated into what we do. not sit as an additional kind of side project. And that's something I'll talk about through today's presentation, because it's obvious we're still working on it, and I think we always will be probably, but it's a big process. And the other one was around adapt. So wanting to be flexible and adaptive, and actually starting to challenge our own structures, perspectives, and look beyond our own lens. And I'll talk a little bit more about the kind of the concepts that we've introduced as the core part of our work around diversity and inclusion, and how we're seeking to do that. So I just wanted to, at this point, introduce sort of the decisions that we made around we call them priority populations, and this will lead into a bit of a conversation around our diversity and inclusion framework. But prior to that, we sort of had already identified, okay, these are the core populations that we need to be thinking about: Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander, LGBTIQ, cultural and linguistic diversity, and people living with disability, and also carers. So we also have some work around carers, and I include carers here because I think they're an important population to consider with the intersections as well. So this visual here sort of looks to show that not only are we looking at each of those unique sets of needs individually, but we also recognise there's a whole huge amount of crossover and intersection in people's experiences of difference and of being part of different communities or identities. The basis for our decision for all of these populations, really, although the four, except for carers, are the ones that we primarily talk about in our diversity and inclusion framework, are the disproportionately high rates of mental ill health. So all of the population groups exhibit that, that each of them have unique barriers to service access and employment, and that those barriers and those disproportionate rates of mental health have been shown to have a direct correlation with experiences of marginalisation, oppression and discrimination. So that was a decision making. It wasn't that there's not there's definitely other populations that we consider as in their own kind of prioritised way. So we work a lot in homelessness now. We've got a range of youth services, and we're looking to develop those. So it's not at the exclusion of those, but it's just in terms of we're working around inclusion generally, but at the same time where we look at those really unique needs and really important, I guess, barriers to consider. These are the populations that we're focusing on at this time. So I was just going to show you a video. I'll actually go back one, actually. So in the centre of this visual, we talk about intersectionality, and so looking at those intersections of oppression and discrimination, and understanding the complexity of people's experience potentially as they experience a range of kind of interrelating experiences of marginalisation. So I'm just going to show you a video. Hopefully this will, work from a technology perspective. But this is just a little video that I came across recently, came out of the UK, and I just think it's one that I often show our teams when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, because it just really nicely talks through intersectionality, and wanted to include it today. I'm assuming I guess a level of understanding of intersectionality perhaps, but I think it's always a good reminder, and it's also just a good tool to be able to share, I think. So here's Sophie.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated, and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and centre the voices and work of marginalised individuals.
Okay, I think that all worked. I think there might have been a little bit of lag in the video there, so apologies for that. I do have another video shortly, and that one doesn't run off the internet, so hopefully that'll improve, but see how we go. And I think Sally is sharing the link for that video in the chat box should anyone wish to have another look at it or use it in the future. So where we got up to, we sort of, when we started doing this, the development of the diversity and inclusion framework last year, we go, okay, we've got these priority populations. We know some really concrete work has to happen around unique needs and barriers, but we also know we're limited by time, resources. We wanted to get something together that sort of positioned where we were going as an organisation. Spent quite a lot of time, you know, thinking through whether it was better to proceed with sort of a population group at a time and move through there. Hang on 1 second. I'm just checking. Hopefully that's showing now. Just getting messages from Sally here that the video visuals are still going. We'll just check. Okay, let's have a look. I think we've had a freeze situation because I haven't got the video open at all. All right, I'll be back in a second. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and then we'll come back, which means you're about to all meet my dogs potentially. So welcome Nala and Dougal to the screen. If you can see them, otherwise just ignore that comment and then share screen to, there we go. Okay, hopefully that is now looking at a visual. Oh, still video. Okay, all right. I think Not sure what to do here. I'll stop sharing again. Right, this is those moments when you realise maybe you shouldn't have decided to show a video from the internet. Anyway, let's try one more time. Okay. Okay. Very strange. All right, let me just, I'm going to try something else. Just that if we do. I see the video is still running. Okay. Okay, so let's try this again. Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. I have no idea what your experience just was, but it probably wasn't ideal. So thanks for sticking with me. All right, so what I will do is probably, there we go, we might skip the other video. So the slide that you're looking at now is basically, and I'm not sure how much of that you heard, but we decided rather than going the different population groups, this is all right, one sec. Okay, we're back. Well, I mean, I guess the good news out of that entire process is that you did get to see Dougal and Nala. Dougal's the small one, Nala's the big one. Anyway, all right, so this talks to what we wanted to underpin our direction with the framework, and that was that we wanted to make sure that rather than having sort of focusing on a population group at a time, which runs the risk of missing intersectionality, and also that we're not getting change fast enough, basically. We wanted to move forward with, while understanding unique needs and making sure that any part of the process that we developed was recognising different unique needs for different communities and identities and experiences, that underpinning it all were these what we've called critical concepts. So this visual here talks to kind of what that means. So the individual in the middle is a person, and they have a range of factors and experiences that they are interrelated with. And the key thing here is really that any one of us has a relationship with anything in these circles, and a whole bunch of other ones as well. So for example, I'm non-Aboriginal, but that means that as a non-Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, I have an experience of the world which is related to me being non-Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. So it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It just means that my experience is about not being non-Aboriginal. So we wanted to position that first, that we all have these range of experiences. It's about us, a kind of collective experience and variance within that. And at the same time, marked in red, we have sort of some of the factors that sit within the priority population groups or have particular challenges related to these concepts. So the concepts being things like discrimination-related stress. We know that that people who sit within minority groups or marginalised groups have higher incidence of mental health distress, and in some cases physical health also, and that also there can be an experience of minority stress. which relates to not necessarily, it might be sort of day-to-day discrimination, but it can also be a kind of underlying sense of vigilance or fear of discrimination, which can change the way a person walks through and relates within the world that they're in. I think from an LGBTIQ plus perspective, that's really important when thinking about mainstream service access and fears around disclosure or acceptance or inclusion. Also, unconscious bias. This is a really, I mean, I talk about unconscious bias all the time, but I think it's so pivotal because the key thing about unconscious bias is that we all have it, and it's often out of step with our values or how we like to think we feel about the world that we live in. So my kind of example of that is, you know, and we heard it plenty of times during the marriage equality postal survey nightmare from last year, which, you know, that I'm not homophobic, but I'm not transphobic, but, and then followed with homophobic, transphobic comment. And this is one we really talk about with recruitment, because with best of intentions, we still are going to make decisions about what feels familiar or comfortable or safe in ways that are often out of step with actually cultivating inclusion and difference of thought and experience. Privilege and power, so recognising that some people have a little bit more of a block to stand on, and that block level changes for everyone, but that we have to acknowledge it if we're actually thinking about access to service and also access to employment. And just below that, also just talking around intersectionality and how that also creates another layer, I guess, for people of where their different experiences of identity or culture or experience meet. So this, so this one generally sits, when we talk about this within teams, we also tend to position this. So this is, as a service, what do we want to do? We want to create culturally competent, responsive, safe and accessible environments. And then put together here a kind of scale of, if we were at the high end of that, which is what we're aiming for as an organisation, what would be the factors that would help us to know that we're there? And that's things like, we'd recognise unique and varying needs relating to diversity factors. We'd prioritise accessibility and inclusion and challenge existing structures and perspectives. And we'd actually have the policies, practices and attitudes in place that affirm and value those differences. So that's the ideal, and that's kind of what we're working towards trying to have fairly consistently across the organisation. This is a really good one I've found to have in discussions with teams or with managers about where they feel their team or their region sits at the moment. And I generally have always worked from the assumption that our organisation sits around the mid-zone. So it's some really, really good pockets of work. It's just not consistent, and some places there's lots of work to do. What I've found actually though is that in some cases sitting with teams saying, well, no, we actually think we're still probably in the low zone in terms of really addressing what it means to have a really inclusive. And it's not the norm for us at all, but it is. It was just kind of a reminder to me that there's always work to do in this space, and it's you can never really know within an organisation of close to 1,000 people that where everyone sits and how everyone's feeling. So kind of just reinforces and I guess energises me in doing this work also. So this is a nice, pretty visual version of the diversity and inclusion framework, which we launched in November last year. So that had been in the work for quite a few years, and it got to this place of, okay, this is what it's going to look like. It was really, I think, the really exciting thing about the framework was it locked down some commitments from us as an organisation. And the most important thing about it was actually getting our CEO and our national leadership team to say, yep, we want this to happen. Yes, we understand the proposed direction of it and we're on board with it, which actually has given us the kind of license in our team and across a number of teams to go, okay, well, we're going to prioritise this work. And I think the biggest part of that has been actually the organisation saying, yes, we do have an obligation as a mainstream mental health organisation to be considering this and actively looking to address barriers and move beyond treating everyone the same to really understanding these unique needs and what our role is in actually addressing some of these disproportionately high rates of mental ill health in certain communities in a really active way. So the framework sits as the 3 points around the outside are our principles. So social justice and human rights, innovative and effective business operations. So where we're putting kind of proposals forward for change, we generally try to do the business and social benefits so that we're making sure we're keeping in check with both, and celebration of difference. So not just because it's right to do it, but because it's really valuable to us to have people across the organisation from all different backgrounds and experiences, and to really elevate and I guess share the common humanity that we can when we do that. The capabilities that you'll see there, the 5 capabilities, so inclusive leadership, culture and governance, a dynamic and diverse culture and workforce, safe, quality and accessible services, consumer, customer leadership and co-design, and robust and responsive systems and policies. So each of these capability areas, they're essentially what we're measuring to, and under each of them sits about 4 or 5 standards that we have set as somewhat aspirational but also achievable. So the framework goes for 3 years, so I think 2020 it would be due for review, and in that time we would aim to be meeting those standards. And I haven't included the standards here, but I'm very happy to provide them or a copy of the framework to anyone that is interested. So I was going to, just checking the time, I was going to show a video there, but I think we might give that a miss after the last experience and just push on. But it was a video basically of staff and consumers from Neami talking about those critical concepts and how they relate to their everyday life and what they hope moving forward. And again, happy to try and share that on another forum if possible. So we all know that with frameworks, policies, etc., often you can have pieces of paper that feel really good and you kind of think you've done the job, but you haven't. I've always seen our diversity and inclusion framework as I said before, as a license to do some really good work, and a kind of a green light that the organisation's behind it and wants change. So then we started asking in our team the kind of question of, how does change actually occur? How do we know that we've made a meaningful difference to anyone's life, to consumer access, to experiences of Neami as a workplace? And how do we do it in a way that actually challenges existing power structures and perspectives? So, you know, I think we talked a little bit also about, you know, when you're talking about change, you can think about technical change or cultural change, and technical change being the kind of the things that you do. And cultural change being, well, what does it look like? What does it feel like? How does it change the organisation as a whole? So we're recognising, I guess, 2 things. Firstly, that there's a whole lot of power and privilege in top-down decision making, and that we need to try and be thinking about how we equalise some of that through elevating the voices of people who haven't necessarily had the same access to have a voice, but that's quite challenging to do, because that structure exists in our organisation because it exists more widely in our society, and we're also bound by the pressures of funding rounds and often reducing funding and short-term contracts for service models, efficiency, risk, all of these kind of concerns. But at the same time saying, well, we're still committed. We want something that isn't tokenistic. We don't want it to be tick box, and we want something that it truly drives change. So we sort of thought, well, we have to try and think a bit differently about this, and you know, because it was sort of a point where we go, well, we kind of got all the best practice literature. I reckon we can go out and start thinking about what changes we need to make. But I mean, I guess the issue there is we haven't actually we hadn't asked enough people who actually are affected by our service. So We'd been doing in our team a bit of work around design thinking, and one of the processes we'd learnt was human-centred design. And so we thought, well, one of the team members, she talked about, well, what about we apply this to this project we were starting to talk about as an implementation project for making the framework come to life. So human-centred design is built around a few different things: a deep sense of empathy, an absolute commitment to co-design, and to developing tailor-made solutions that really include the voices of those who the change would most affect. So that was kind of the starting point. So we launched this project called Welcoming In, which is basically, well, it's a human-centred design process that looks at consultation as its initial point. So we did, there's about 3 of us working on the project, and we've, over the course of the last few months, done 20 one-on-one interviews or feedback sessions with consumers from who represented one or more experiences of the priority population groups, and then followed that up with about 12 one-on-one consultations with staff who nominated themselves, who have direct experience, lived experience relating to the priority population groups. So they were all anonymous, and what we did is basically said, all right, this is all the stuff that we've been thinking about. These are some of the concepts. What's your experience? And have been kind of using their input to guide where we go from here. So I wanted to share a little bit about what we've been hearing through this process. So these are the kind of some of the key points that came out of the consumer consultations. So the first one was, and I think this is it's almost a no-brainer, but really just highlighted that actually the visibility of flags, of acknowledgements, of inclusive language, of stuff that showed you thought about this and you were trying to reach out was absolutely vital. Intersections, so understanding and valuing people's intersectionality in a way that's equal. So I spoke to one person who experienced disability called background and so identifies as a lesbian, and she said she often felt like she needed to leave her sexuality at the door when she went into a disability service, and a disability at the door when she went into, say, a mental health service. So really recognising that people want to bring their entire selves into support services. Maybe not everyone, but there should at least be the option, and not this feeling of having to leave things behind when you walk through the doors. Staff knowledge, a requirement to get basics right. I thought it was a really reasonable point that came through. Actually, was kind of not that everyone needs to be the expert, but perhaps just to show some interest and curiosity, and that sometimes people felt when they were, particularly there was a high level of intersectionality, that they were sort of often the object of curiosity and wanting workers or support people wanting to find out from them, what their experience was like. And I should say also, it doesn't look like this was all NEMA. This was from people from a range of services and mental. So basically the requirement for consumers was that they had access mental health services now or in the past, may or may not have been NEMA, and were representatives of the priority population groups. So exploring identity, exploring it's okay. So we did speak to one person who'd been wonderful, very involved person who's been working with NEMA for a long time, said they wanted to have a conversation about sexuality because they have a disability, and it just was never really an opportunity to bring it up, and when they did, they felt like it was uncomfortable and not really, there wasn't a space to explore it. So it raised some really big questions for us about how do we create comfortable spaces to have those conversations that don't expect every staff member to know exactly the right thing to say all the time, because that is not necessarily possible. Not omitting identity and culture and ability away from mental health. So a lot of people come to us and they just want to talk about their mental health, but also sometimes there's relationships between these things. And I spoke to a trans man who talked about just wanting to coming in as a person going through transition and having conversations about that with one person, and again not being able to have those conversations in mental health service, or just not coming up. So just asking, I guess, for the being okay to bring it up and at least ask those questions, and also seeking and valuing lived experience. We had some amazing stories of connection that have come from people where there's a shared experience or identity, and that's not always the case, but just noting that the lived experience, walking into a service, seeing people that look like you, particularly from people from different cultural backgrounds, makes a difference, or seeing something that's familiar makes a big difference. So this is some of what we heard back from our staff consultations, and that was starting with leadership. So really kind of highlighting that teams want leaders to lead from the front on this, and to lead from the front around visibility and acknowledgement, that the structures are in place to support people being active in this work, and not leaving it to be to sit with people around passion, who are passionate or have a lived experience all the time. And also just saying, how important it is to have that diversity represented at board and senior leadership levels, because that sends a message right through the organisation. Cultivating cultural safety, so just really jumping on jokes, attitudes that aren't okay really quickly. Also thinking about how you might, unconscious bias might inform judgments about people who are going to be good leaders, or who might like to take on extra opportunities, because we spoke to people, particularly from, say, someone from a different cultural background, who spoke about, having a different work approach, but not being able to kind of find their voice to talk about what they'd learned, because they weren't necessarily the loudest person in the room. And so just there's real valuings about, what we naturally gravitate to as a strong person, or the best worker, or the best leader, which is really interesting stuff, I think, in thinking about diversity of thought and contribution. So the valuing of lived experience at the top right there. So this was really saying that workers want to be valued for their lived experience. Not everyone, but certainly a lot of the people we spoke to in this project, and having leadership that really supports and understands and cultivates that. And also just getting lived experience into teams, in the sense of asking, say, an elder to come in and have a yarn and have a cup of tea with the team, and actually valuing, how we think about different communities' ways of connecting, and how to include that. So recruitment's a massive one in terms of that lived experience perspective, and also challenging, I guess, unconscious bias. So it's really talked about around how do we look at our recruitment processes. Nemo recruits through a values-based recruitment primarily, which is fantastic, because it means that it's not all about what course you did and all of your experience, but really about who you are. But I guess the other side of that is also acknowledging where there might be some bias to what's familiar and safe, again, in terms of the type of people that you might be more comfortable employing. And practice development, so training always comes up, always comes up, and we're working on that, which we'll talk about in a second. But also having consistent processes, having the structures of the organisation set up so that there are prompts and reminders around inclusion, and that it's not always sort of invisible and up to people to remember, but actually integrated. For example, for feedback, for exit interviews, that there's a question that asks people what their experience was of feeling included, and particularly in relation to sexuality, gender, ability, etc. So, yeah, I think they were some of the main things we heard back from staff, and I'm conscious of time now, so I'll move through a little bit quicker. So from that, we sort of determined that there are 3 key areas we wanted to address coming out of this project. So leadership and accountability, recruitment and workforce, and practice. And I've worked out after many years how to make things come up one at a time on PowerPoint, so it's a big victory for me. So we talked about an inclusivity checklist, so something that sites and teams can be using to actually check that they're doing the basics right, and that's something that's in development at the moment. We're having some workshops around that coming up. And inclusive leadership workshops. So we've been doing these over sort of the past 12 months. They developed sort of quite organically, and now we're doing them with some of our management teams to really think about what they're, dig into sort of those issues around unconscious bias and what might be ways that they could support greater inclusion in their teams, in their practice. From recruitment and workforce, we're going to hopefully be piloting some recruitment trial projects. It's some research came out of Diversity Council of Australia recently that talked about the fact that some best practice ideas don't necessarily work if you haven't tested them in your organisation. So we're hoping to be doing some kind of recruitment testing process over the next 12 months. And also one of the big things that came through as a recommendation from the welcoming in interviews was actually appraisals and PDSs. So actually having it built into the requirements of everyone's role in the organisation, that this is everyone's business, some kind of line around what they're doing to support inclusion and good practice around diversity in their role, whatever that role might be. We're developing a national online training program, which will have, the core of it will be around those critical concepts and reflective practice around your own bias, experience, etc., and as well as some specialised kind of modules around the unique needs of each of the population groups. So that's in the works at the moment, and I'm hoping that we'll have something up and running by the end of the year. I think we should do, and we may evolve that into having a specialist leadership stream as well. And an identity tool, this one I'm particularly excited about. So this is about having something that workers can use as part of a conversation with consumers that is not about checking a box of what identity you fit into, but rather going back to that earlier visual I showed you with the individual and all the circles, something like that says, what are all these things? What are the key parts of you that make up who you are? How do they connect with your experience out in the world? How does that relate to your mental health? So we start to kind of, I guess, pull back some of the discomfort around having those conversations and equip workers and consumers with a way to have those conversations that isn't just because it just came up, but rather a really active process of understanding how all of those factors contribute to someone's experience of mental health and wellbeing. So we will look to develop that over the next few months and do some testing with that also. So that'll be the testing phase. So with each of the kind of the new initiatives that we're developing, we're hoping to tie in some kind of evaluation process that includes consumers and staff in assessing what is actually working, what feels good, and what particularly fits our context and our work. And moving forward, I guess, with confidence that what we're doing is actually hitting the mark, and it is not something that we're doing just because it seems like it might be a good idea or that it feels good to do that. So I'm trying to be really accountable with that, and all of that taps into that that human-centered design process as well, and particularly getting the feedback continually through consumers and staff. I think that sort of brings me to the end. There's our end goal. I think it's a lofty goal, and we'll keep working on it. And I think there's we're always learning ways and means, and I think there's no one right way to do this. So it's constantly challenging, going, we're doing the right thing here. But I think I always just try to think if we're continually moving forward and continually asking ourselves good questions and trying to contribute positive change that is in line with what we're hearing from the people who most need it, is that it's on track with that. So that sort of brings me to the end of everything I was going to say. That's my contact details there. And very happy, I'll leave that up for a second. Very happy to obviously answer any questions now, but also happy to, if there's anything that popped up that's useful or you'd like to talk through or you've got feedback, I'm really always open to talking with people as much as possible outside our organisation as well. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. Just really encourage people, if you have any questions at the moment, to post them to Katie. There's just a text box, a chat box that you can type your question into that we will see and be able to pass those questions on to Katie. I guess I find I've seen you present this a couple of times, Katie, and I find it really quite interesting because obviously one of the key purposes of the MindOUT project is around supporting the broader sector to become more inclusive to LGBTI populations. So for me, it's really exciting to see how organisations are tackling this and thinking about it, and going on that process of learning and reflection. And I think that's one thing I actually really appreciate when I hear you speak, is this is journey type metaphor, I think, going on, where you go, this is what we're trying, this is what we're hearing, this is what we're learning, which I think is a really great place for organisations to be at. So it doesn't...
Yeah, I think it's... So if there's any questions.
Yeah, no questions as of yet. A couple of thank yous. So actually, yes.
Thanks for sticking by through the technical difficulties. That was an ordeal, wasn't it?
It was a little bit. Okay, so question from Laura. Who are you in full-time... are you in a full-time dedicated position to do this project, or is this additional to other roles in the organisation?
I am not. My role is a fairly broad role, being across innovation and projects. But I would say that, so there's myself, and then there's 2 project officers that work with me in the team, as well as our senior manager. And I'd say, look, this is a lot of my work at the moment, but I do work across other projects as well. But we also, so that work's shared across myself and the 2 project officers. I would say that at the moment in our work in this space, would be a full-time equivalent role across the 3 of us focused on diversity and inclusion. I can't remember it. We did map this out recently. It might even be touch more. So we're putting quite a lot of resources behind it at this particular point. And what the hope is that in the long term, that it doesn't require that. The idea is that that this stuff is embedded into the way that the organisation functions, so that if we step out or whatever, it's not reliant on one person or a few people to keep it developed. If that makes sense, it should take less work over time.
Great. And a question from Penelope. Can you talk about any challenges you've had or heard about implementing diversity trainings?
Yeah. Well, heaps, I think. I don't think they're I think they're one tool in the toolkit. I don't think it's the only tool. We're developing an online training kit. I think that in itself is a challenge in terms of losing that kind of reflective discussion that you can have when you're face to face. So I think that'll be a really big challenge, how we kind of dig into some of these big concepts in a way that is not sitting in a room of people and exploring them. A challenge in a big organisation like ours, and why we're doing an online training model, is just to actually make sure that everyone is actually trained. At the moment, we can't do that. We have a lot of training, we have a lot of learning and development programs, but diversity and inclusion was missing. So I guess that's the approach that we're taking, is to have this online training model. The other, I guess, the challenge is the way to, address the challenge of how do you get everyone trained and how do you resource that, is again that embedding in it. So the existing training that you might have in an organisation, how do you build in case studies or approaches that are naturally kind of developing inclusive practice learning, while also doing sort of other forms of training. I think they're probably the main one, but I think it is a huge challenge to think about training that's all anyone really wants. That's generally the feedback that I hear, is everyone wants training. So I think another part of that is looking at other ways and means that there can be learning without it always being training, if that makes sense. So we've done things like set up on our intranet. We've got pages for each of the population groups and diversity and inclusion broadly, and we've got videos, content like the intersectionality video, little activities, things like that. So little ways that people can go and be a bit more autonomous if they want to.
Great. And a question here from Evelyn, who's one of the Neami staff. So Evelyn asks, actually says, I'm an LGBTI SF, which I believe would be support facilitator with Neami in Metro South and Brisbane. Do you envisage that Neami will create more of these positions?
I think that one is particularly funded Partners in Recovery, so PIR is a specialist role. So that's what's happened with that position. It's a really interesting question. We have talked about through the welcoming in process. One of the things that's come up was having specialised peer workforces or specialised kind of consultant positions around the population groups. Look, I think it's a possibility. I don't think it's the only or the necessarily the way that we will go forward. I think one of the difficulties of having sort of specialised positions can be that it falls to one person, or it's sort of like that's their thing. And I think that's one of the risks of that, and also that people can have very, very different experiences of sexuality and gender as they relate to other intersections or just their own experience. So just understanding that one person doesn't necessarily want to always take the load for that. But I think I think ultimately, if you could, you would have more specialised positions as well. But I think it'll depend a little bit on the direction of funding and opportunity to trial things like that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good reflection. We often don't have many targeted positions, mostly because there isn't the funding and the resources. And even for organisations like Neami doing this project to dedicate time to think about diversity often is that dedication of internal resources rather than relying upon external grants or funding, which can make it very difficult for organisations to prioritise and to facilitate that. And then it becomes this conversation about the benefit of targeted services versus more broadly inclusive services. And I think certainly my view that there's probably space for both. In the lack of dedicated funding for LGBTI positions, we sort of have to take the broader inclusive pathway.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So I think if we had capacity to trial that, say in each state with a couple of different workers, I'd love to do that. I think we're just constantly trying to work how do we do things in the with the resources we have. But I think I certainly, from what I understand, that role has been really, really fantastic up in Brisbane. So I think it's a good example and might be one to share as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Katie, for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us today, and encourage people to touch base with you if they have any further questions. I'll be emailing all the participants today a evaluation link, which I'll probably send out tomorrow. So if you can just give us some feedback on the webinar, and certainly we're already noting that the little technology we had in the middle, but at the same time we got to see Katie's dogs. So
there's a real upside to that. So that's great news. They're famous finally.
Yes. So thank you very much for joining us. Next month we actually have, I'm really excited about next month, we actually have Jackie Jacks-Brown, an LGBTI disability activist, talking about her work and I guess that intersectionality between disability and sexuality, gender and diverse bodies. So you'll be seeing an invitation for that webinar shortly. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you all again next month. So thank you.
Thank you.